So, hello, Marcus Alexander Stiglegger. Before we get into our discussion on Italian Naziploitation movies, please tell my audience a bit about yourself.
Yeah, hello. It's my pleasure to be there. Um, I'm teaching film at a private university at Berlin at the moment, and yeah, I've been teaching film studies for about 20 years now. And I wrote my PhD in 1999 on the topic of Sadico Nazista, which you call Nazi exploitation films, probably. And so this kind of damaged my career for many years, as you can imagine, because it tangled so many taboo topics in Germany that, but at the same time, it did well for my reputation worldwide, as I became quite known as a specialist on this topic as well. So that's one aspect of my work, I guess.
So, please tell my audience what an Italian Nazi exploitation movie is usually about.
Um, Italian film productions in during the 70s normally followed the success of one international production, sometimes American productions, English productions, that gave a kind of a model. And they try to create a copy with more violence, with more sexuality to get their audiences. So when there was a huge success in Italy by films like The Night Porter by Liliana Cavani or the Pascalino Sette Bellezze, Seven Beauties by Lina Wertmüller, the first film probably, which a little bit can seem connected in the Nazi exploitation context, is Pier Paolo Pasolini's Salo. Salo is a reading of Marquis de Sade's novel, The 120 Days of Sodom, transported into the era of Italian fascism and showing the perpetrators as sadistic fascists who exploit the Italian youth. So the film was meant as an intellectual critique of the Italian tendencies of the mid-70s, but at the same time the film was marketed in some countries, including Germany, as a kind of grindhouse film, which is really unjust concerning this film. But at the same time, the film contains a lot of sexual violence connected with fascist politics. The first film, which is probably considered pure Nazi exploitation on the highest level, is Salon Kitty by Tinto Brass. And this film also has a strong connection to German fascism, National Socialism, and shows German SS commanders, officers connected with extreme sexual practices. But also, this film has a serious background, as it is has a historical context. There actually was this brothel called Salon Kitty in the Third Reich in Germany, and at the same time, this film has very high production values, designed by Ken Adam, for example, and is cast with Ingrid Thulin or Helmut Berger. So this film is probably the boss league of the Nazi exploitation film. And then we have a series of very cheaply produced rip-offs of these concepts. And some of them were closer to Salon Kitty, some of them were closer to The Night Porter, for example, Gestapo's Last Orgy by Canevari. This is a kind of rip-off of The Night Porter. And actually, this tendency was between 1976 and 1978, and then it stopped. And those films were not really successful at that time. It was later in the era of the video, especially of the video nasties in England or the German forbidden films affairs in the 80s, that these films popped up and became quite legendary. So this is probably what you have to know when getting in touch with it.
Is this the most incendiary kind of Italian movie in your opinion?
I think it is, even for Italian standards, these films go pretty far in their depiction of historical aspects and the sexualization of politics. So it is probably similar to the witchploitation films, which have this context of the Inquisition and the Catholics hunting for witches. But at the same time, there is a huge historical distance towards this context, while the aspects of right-wing politics and neo-Nazism, they are pretty present at the moment, at least. So as a matter of fact, in Germany, these films, the exploitation versions of these films, they were not really marketed. It was not possible to get them into the cinemas, and not even on videotapes. I remember that when I wanted to get hold of these Italian films like Deported Women of the SS Special Section or Gestapo's Last Orgy, I had to travel to Holland, where they were available in the Cult Videothek in Amsterdam, but that was the only chance to even get a copy of these films.
So, what do you think about the Italian Nazi porno films, such as Gestapo's Last Orgy by Bruno Mattei, or Sound of His Ghost by Lucio Fulci? What do you think about this style of film?
I think they are, even compared to the 70s tendencies, these are even weaker in their production values, in their castings. And I think it is an attempt to cash into earlier kinds of successes. As I said, those films were not really successful in the beginning. So I think it was just a tendency during the 80s to get back to the old concepts, but they didn't really work anymore. So Sodoma's Ghost, for example, by Lucio Fulci, is one of his weakest films, in my opinion. And it seems pretty helpless when dealing with these elements, whereas a film like Deported Women of the SS Special Section in 1977 by Rino De Silvestro, it is a quite trashy film in some aspects, but at the same time, it has some strong moments. It has this very depraved, loving depiction of the torture chamber scenes and all these things, which are quite gothic horror in a way. So I think the 70s films are much stronger and are produced in a working context of exploitation film or exploitation cinema in Italy, whereas the 80s films were produced as rip-offs of the rip-offs already, and in a kind of dying Italian genre cinema during the mid and late 80s.
What can you say about the porn created under the actual Third Reich?
There is there is kind of an evidence that there were porn films produced during the whole film history, so also under the helm of the Nazis during the Third Reich, and they are handled in a German novel called Endstufe by Thor Kunkel. I think it might be translated into English by now, but this novel it describes films being produced in the under the helm of the Nazi Party. So there is none of these films is available. So you have a lot of films like film clips available, which were made during the Weimar Republic, so in the 20s. But there is none of such films available during the 30s and 40s, and they were probably destroyed or something. But there are people, witnesses, who say they did exist. But today, I would say it's a kind of a myth. So the novel handles it as a kind of myth, which is dramatized and into a narrative fiction then.
Do you have any general comments about Joseph Goebbels' film industry?
The Nazi film industry was not interested in producing porn films, obviously, but they were aiming towards crowd-pleasing, huge productions which calmed down the German public, which were troubled by the things going on, by the war around them. And there were also strong tendencies towards the end of the war to produce films which were called Durchhaltefilme, films made for motivating people to stand up during the war. But most of these films produced during the Third Reich were entertainment films like musical films or melodramas, kind of German melodramas. Some of these films were made very well. For example, a film like Opfergang by Veit Harlan. But these films are still pretty much criticized for carrying the values of the Nazi era and the ideology, although they were not taking place in a military system because most of the Nazi films, they did not touch really the military system or even the ideology very obviously. There were propaganda films, they were produced, and there were anti-Semitic propaganda films, which is quite well known, but it was not the majority of films. So a film like Jud Süß or, which is more extreme, The Eternal Jew, Der ewige Jude, which are very extreme propaganda films, they were not that typical for that era. So most of the people saw the entertainment films at that time. But these films were very tame when it comes to sexuality. So if there were pornographic films produced during the Third Reich, these films were produced very much under the radar and only for very private purposes.
Do you think the outrageousness seen in the Italian Naziploitation films somehow, in a weird sense, captures the surrealism that fascism might have actually felt like?
Okay, there are different theories about this, especially why Italians into dealing with German Nazis being a sexual threat to, especially to women. I think the Italian fascism is one of the key elements because Italian fascism was very physical. Benito Mussolini created a very masculine and very physical idea of militarism. So the Italian perspective on this right-wing ideology was very much based on this kind of physical qualities and power and strength. At the same time, when you see the Nazi ideology and how the Nazi Party represented themselves, they were not that masculine, they were not that virile as Benito Mussolini presented himself. So it was a kind of a mixture which went into politics and sexual excess. This happened already during the 60s, where there was a kind of pulp fiction called Sadico-Nazista, sadism, con-Nazism, as a combined. So I used films in my book, and probably this is already based on the anti-Nazi propaganda during the wartime, and German Nazis were depicted in propaganda posters as kind of a sexual the women. So this dates back to the war already, the sexualization of the Nazis.
What can you say? Sorry.
Yep.
Okay.
It happened also in America in the men's magazines, and also in Israel in the Stalag magazines during the 60s.
Oh, So, what can you say about the film that Severin Films recently released called The Beast in Heat?
Yeah, Beast in Heat is one of the most notorious films because it uses experiments by Nazi scientists, especially a female Nazi scientist, a very evil femme fatale. And this ape man is presented as a sexual threat for the female victims. So this film combines certain a very crude idea of Nazi researches, and at the same time the idea to control them and to use them and all these things. So this film, a kind of naive and irresponsible dealing with actual Nazi, but it is a sexploitation film. It is kind of fun if you like those crude sexualization in films, and but it is totally ahistorical, as you might guess.
Should and could there be a modern Nazi exploitation subgenre cycle that focuses on the alt-right?
I'm not sure. Do you think of a film depicting recent events dealt with in the way of a Nazi exploitation film?
That's what I'm suggesting, yes.
Okay. The funny thing is that if you see some of the aspects of the alt-right which are transported over the news, there's a strong subtext of homoeroticism, for example, within the movement of the Proud Boys. And they wouldn't agree, I guess, but there is this aspect. And homoeroticism is also very present in Nazi exploitation films from Italy. If you see how Helmut Berger, for example, plays his main role in Salon Kitty, he's very homoerotic in his gestures and in his way of talking, although he is playing a heterosexual guy in a way. But so this is probably an element, but I doubt this a little bit if you can use it the same way, because you need this whole system, this unified ideology, which is present in the Third Reich as a historical fact. So the corporate identity, the uniforms, the buildings, everything is aimed into one direction. And I think this gives a very strong aesthetic context in which these ideas of the sexualization of this ideology kind of works for these films. And this is not really present in recent events. I give you another probably interesting example. In Austria, there was a film made, The Inheritors. I think this is out on DVD in America. And this film is about neo-Nazis in the early 80s in Austria. And they are dressing up in parts of uniforms, and they are doing this field exercises. And there's also very strong sexual activity, even with underaged young people. But I think these scenes were actually censored from the American version, so you won't see the sexual activity that much. But I've recently seen the Austrian version, which is really heavy in that aspect. So this might be one of the rare films where sexploitation and neo-Nazis were actually combined that way. Probably another example would be Rumpelstomper, the neo-Nazi skinhead drama from Australia. By Geoffrey Wright, which made Russell Crowe a star. And this film as well has a very strong sexualized approach to neo-Nazi activities, but this film already has this strong aesthetical context within the subculture of the skinheads. So you probably need that imagery. And if this kind of works, it might be possible.
All right, well, Marcus, thank you very much for your time. Before I let you go, what do you have planned for 2020?
What do I have planned?
Yeah.
Okay. There is a book actually coming out, my first purely book in English, which is about the history and the heritage of the film Cruising with Al Pacino
Ooh.
by William Friedkin. This film is becoming 40. It was released in 1980, and I think it's a very important film from the late New Hollywood era. It's a very groundbreaking, transgressive film in a way, dealing with homosexual S&M subculture in New York. And I think this film is worth a book. So I write this together with a friend from Rome, Eugenio Ercolani. And so this book will be out in England next year and will be available in the US as well. So you can read me in English if you like.
Well, that's fun stuff. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, a pleasure. Thank you so much.